I will focus on some of the Ottoman or Oriental elements, or elements which were perceived as being Ottoman and Oriental in the development of a very particular war culture in Transylvania during this period, with some insights on cavalry warfare, on the management of border defense. Then we will see two organizational models which were adopted and then adapted from the Ottoman Empire into this Christian European state. And last but not least, we will see a few examples of cross-cultural transfer of technology and material culture dealing in relation to warfare and military organization. So, first of all, a few words about Transylvania, about the Principality of Transylvania. Initially, during the Middle Ages, Transylvania was a province within the Kingdom of Hungary. It was a voivodeship. This was the official name of the province within the realm of St. Stephen, Kingdom of Hungary. Although it was a late conquest of the Hungarians when they settled in the Carpathian Basin, and it kept its very particular organization within the kingdom. And this was also because it had a very, and we will see in the next slide, it had very peculiar ethnic and social structure. As you well know, Hungary was confronted with great danger coming from the south with the Ottoman Empire, especially from the end of the 14th century, and after almost 1.5 century of warfare, the Kingdom of Hungary fell under the Ottoman pressure of the military pressure of the Ottoman Empire. In 1526, during the Battle of Mohacs, the armies of Suleiman the Magnificent dealt the decisive blow to the armies of the Hungarian kingdom, led at the time by King Louis II. The king died in the aftermath of the battle, and the consequence was a dissolution of the former Hungarian kingdom, a triple division of the kingdom. As you can see on this map, of course, the southern and central parts of the former Hungarian kingdom were occupied by the Ottomans and transformed into Ottoman provinces, especially after 1541, when the royal seat of Buda was conquered and transformed into the center of a Ottoman province. The northern and western parts of Hungary, including Croatia and Slavonia, were transformed into let's say, a new Hungarian kingdom under the rule of the Habsburgs, and the eastern parts of the former Hungarian kingdom were they initially elected a national, so to speak, a national king, John Szopolyai, and later this region was transformed into the Principality of Transylvania. It was a long process rather than an event. It took several decades for the new polity to gain its and to establish its, let's say, territorial and political identity. But it was basically between the fall of Buda and the peace treaty of Speyer in 1571 when this new state emerged on the maps of early modern Europe. A few details about the organization of the Principality. So, as I said, from the beginning, the region had a very diverse ethnic composition. We had, and we still have actually, a large Romanian community, but also Hungarians, Saxons, which are German settlers, which were brought by the Hungarian kings in the beginning with the 12th century and settled here in the southern parts of the region. Then we also have Ukrainians, Ruthenians, who live in the northern parts of the Principality, in Maramuresh County. Very consistent and large communities of South Slavic population, especially in the southwestern part. What is interesting is that during the age of the Principality, we also had a few groups coming from the territories of the Ottoman Empire and moving into Transylvania, some of them with the approval of the Ottoman sultans. Of course, there were many South Slavs, especially Serbians, who came from the territories which were already occupied by the Ottomans. This was not this was a point of conflict between the two polities. It was often a reason for cross-border raids and so on. But there were also communities which were settled peacefully, like a significant group of Sephardic Jews, which came from Constantinople to Transylvania during the reign of Gabriel Bethlen in the 17th century, and also large communities of Armenians coming, especially during the 17th century, and settling not only in Transylvania, also in Moldavia, but very consistent and quite large communities of Armenian, especially merchants, were established in Transylvania at the time. The total size of the population, of course, we are in the pre-statistic era, and we only have a very rough estimation, was about 1 million people in the second half of the 16th century. And in the 17th century, there was a significant decrease of population because the Principality lost important territories, especially here in the western border. But there were also other demographic factors which influenced these developments. And we have, by the end of the second half of the 17th century, we have roughly 700,000 to 800,000 people. Just before the Principality was occupied by Habsburg troops, and then the Principality was integrated in the composite monarchy of the Habsburgs. From a political point of view, Transylvania was an elective monarchy, just like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth during the same time, because the estates elected the prince, but only with the consent of the Sultan, and then the Ottoman Sultan also confirmed the election. But also, this was a very important feature of political identity for Transylvanians, but in fact, it was always the Sultan who decided beforehand who the new ruler should be. And then, of course, there was an official recognition, but the Sultan took the first step, or not necessarily the Sultan himself, but the other Ottoman officials who were influential at the court at the time. The prince was aided in the process of government by a council, which usually consisted of 12 members of the high nobility, and also a very important institution was the Diet, basically, as you well know, medieval parliament, which consisted, an assembly of estates, which consisted of 3 estates in Transylvania. Although the ethnic diversity was very, very large, so to speak, only a few of the people living in Transylvania exercised political rights at the time, and we have these 3 estates. The nobility. The nobility is, of course, in its great majority, was Hungarian. But a significant part of the Romanian social elite had been already integrated. Also, many South Slavic families, especially Serbians and Croatians who settled there, who had been nobles in the Kingdom of Croatia or had been members of the social elite in Serbia, were their status was recognized. They received new donations in their new land, and they became part of the nobility. So nobility was not something very homogeneous from an ethnic point of view, but rather from a social point of view. The second estate was represented by the Saxons, which were German-speaking settlers who were, as I said, colonized in the southern parts of the province. But most of them were Germans, but they were also, many of them came from other Western European regions. And the third estate was represented by the settlers. They were a smaller population who migrated to Europe, to the Carpathian Basin, together with the Hungarians in their early stage of their settlement in this region, and they were allied people, and they were settled in the eastern parts of the province, and they were given privilege as a community. they enjoyed a status, they were exempted from all taxes in exchange for military service. They had to defend the frontier, and they kept this status until the age of the Principality, when they lost their common privileges, and only a part of the community still performed military service. Alright, so basically this is the population and the political situation and the social one as well in Transylvania, in the Principality. Now, Ottoman suzerainty was a process that was installed in phases. And it all began in 1528, 2 years after the Battle of Mohacs, when King John Sapoyali, the national king of the eastern part of the kingdom, which I showed you earlier, decided to ask the Ottoman Sultan for help, because he was no match for his adversary, for Ferdinand of Habsburg, and he asked the Sultan and the Ottomans for help, and of course the Sultan was very glad to offer his protection, and as a consequence, of course, he became a vassal of the Ottoman Sultan. In 1541, when the royal seat was conquered, just 1 year after the death of King John Sapoyali, his son, who was still a child at the time, John Sigismund or John II, was taken by the Sultan and sent to the eastern part of the kingdom. And from Suleiman's perspective, the eastern part of the kingdom became a province. And the young heir of John Sapoyali became, from his point of view, he was just like an Ottoman district governor, not an independent ruler. But in fact, the Ottomans never managed to integrate Transylvania within the social and the administrative framework of the empire, and it remained a tributary state. And as it was custom at the time, the relationship between the Sultan and the tributary state was established within the so-called capitulations, adname, which were given to each Transylvanian ruler when they were elected and confirmed by the Ottoman Sultan. Each ruler received a new capitulation, but each new capitulation had a similar pattern. The provisions were mainly the same. Of course, there were some small differences, but in essence, the obligations of the tributary state was first and foremost to pay a tribute, which was initially 10,000 florins, and then it was increased in the second half of the 17th century. Another obligation was to offer military and logistic assistance, especially when the Ottoman army was fighting on the European front. The Prince of Transylvania had to send troops, and sometimes also provisions and supplies for the Ottoman army. Also, information was very important. The rulers of Transylvania had the obligation to provide information about the intentions or the movement troops of the enemy, especially the Habsburgs, but also the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And in the 17th century, a new provision was added to the capitulation. The ruler of Transylvania was obligated to keep good relation with the other tributary states, namely Moldavia and Wallachia. So the Principality of Transylvania lasted for about 150 years. Of course, it was not always smooth. It was not a very smooth relation. There were some rebellions, but if we add up all the years of rebellion, we have maybe 10 years of rebellion and 140 years of good relations. So this political context was, it worked very well at the time. Okay, now the Transylvanian army. I always like to say that the army of the Principality is like a mirror of the Transylvanian society, because within the army we have represented, all the main social groups are represented in the army, each group with its own military detachment. And from the following a criteria of mobilization and recruitment, we can divide the various elements of the army into two main groups. First of all, we have those detachments which were provided by the estates, like the county banners, which consisted of all nobles, because all the nobility had the obligation to personally attend the army. But in addition, they had to they had to bring a certain number of armed servants. And most of the time these were conscripted peasants. In a way, the county banners functioned like the Timariot system, like the Timar system in the Ottoman Empire, with each Sipahi, holder of the Timar, had the obligation to bring a certain number of armed servants. In a similar manner, the Transylvanian nobleman had the obligation to bring a retinue of armed servants. And then the Saxons also provided infantry militia, usually very well armed with, they were well equipped with gunpowder weapons, and they also managed the artillery of the Principality, because the Saxons were the most urbanized, they had the most urbanized region of Transylvania. They had towns with defensive walls, and they also had good artillery, so they had this obligation to provide artillery for the army. The settlers, they also provided mixed detachments of infantry and cavalry, although they had a very good reputation of being excellent horsemen, and they also were very good at breeding horses in their territories, so they had a reputation of good cavalry. And then we also have very small detachments of infantry sent by the towns, the town militias, but they were very small in size, maybe a few hundred at most, from all the towns of Transylvania. And the second group is represented by those soldiers who were directly under the control of the prince. They were mercenaries, which received regular wages, and most of them were locals, but there were also foreigners. Throughout the age of the Principality, we have many groups of foreigners who performed military service, but it was not necessarily something out of the common, because all European armies at the time employed foreign mercenaries. Then there were also troops in the fortress garrisons, which were directly under the control of the prince. And these were very important because the Principality invested a lot of resources in building a defensive system meaning many fortifications and people to defend them. Some of them were mercenaries who received regular wages, but there were also groups of semi-privileged peasant soldiers who lived in the vicinity of fortresses. They were basically serfs and peasants. They did agriculture and maybe some crafts, but they also had to perform military service every now and then. And in case of necessity, in case of an attack, they all had to join the resident garrison. And in exchange for this temporary military service, they were exempted from paying most taxes. Okay. Now, Antun Vrancic was a Croatian humanist who had spent many years at the court of the kings of Hungary. And in the 1530s or maybe the 1540s, he wrote a book, the Rebus Gestis Hungarorum, in which at a certain point he describes the Transylvanian nobility. And basically he says that a long time ago all the nobles were heavily armored. But now, meaning the 1530s and 1540s, now they are all lightly armed and are called in the common speech, in the common language, they are called hussars. Of course, this is an interesting observation made by somebody who knew the realities of the military organization of the Principality at the time. But in fact, the situation was much older. He only observed the end of the process, because even from the middle of the 15th century, the Hungarian army and the Transylvanian nobility as well began to change. And the reason for this change was the wars against the Ottomans. And Vrancic is he explicitly says this change has happened because of the wars with the Ottomans. But the hussars, as I said, had already begun to represent an important proportion within the armies of the Hungarian kingdom from the times of Matthias Corvinus, and then their numbers increased, especially when compared to the heavily armored cavalry, especially during the reign of the last two Jagiellonian kings, Vladislav II and Louis II. And if you look at this illustration, which is based on narrative sources and on the few existing visual sources from the age, you can observe some Oriental elements in the, let's say, in the arsenal of this mounted Transylvanian nobleman. The first and the most, maybe even the most important element is the helmet. The shishak type, this is the name it got in Hungarian, which was of Ottoman origin or Oriental origin. I think it's still debated, but this type of helmet became very common in all over Central and Southeastern Europe, and it even moved even farther away in Western Europe, a similar type of helmet of Ottoman inspiration. Also, the curved saber became one of the most important weapons, hand weapons used by the nobility. Before that, they used the typical Western European straight swords, but now the sabers, the Oriental sabers, were dominant. And another element, which is not very visible here, is the asymmetric, the wing-shaped shield, which once again has a very debated origin, but we can agree that it originated somewhere in the Balkans, in the Ottoman occupied Balkans during the let's say 14th, 15th century. So cavalry warfare in Hungary and in Transylvania changed because of the wars with the Ottomans. And because the Transylvanian cavalrymen did not use heavy equipment anymore, they also began to look for different breeds of horses. The older breeds, which were more resistant, were no longer useful, and they began to favor the Turkish horse, which was once again, it had a smaller frame, it was a smaller horse, but it was much more resilient, and it was faster. It was better adapted to the new type of warfare that was fought along the Habsburg Ottoman borderland. And these horses were very expensive. And I only chose one example. In 1579, a good Turkish horse from Wallachia, actually, it was brought from Wallachia, was sold in Transylvania for 15 florins. Maybe the number doesn't say much by itself, but for the same amount of money, a Transylvanian noble could have bought two riding horses, war horses, but local breeds, together horses with harnesses and trappings. And for the same money, he could have bought 4 or maybe even 5 draft horses, so horses used for traction, for carriages. So this was a very high price for a war horse. Turkish horses were also very important from a symbolic point of view, because when the Ottoman Sultan confirmed a new Transylvanian prince, the newly elected candidate would receive some gifts from the Sultan. And the most important gift, the first gift which was presented to the new ruler of the Principality, was a Turkish horse, which a Turkish horse with richly decorated harnesses and trappings. But there were also other symbolic objects which were sent by the Sultan to the new ruler of the Principality. For example, Ottoman headdress with crane feathers, red banners, hawks, and of course richly decorated Turkish sabers. So the Turkish horse became a very expensive commodity, also from a material, but also from a symbolic point of view. Right, let's move on to frontier defense. As I said before, Transylvania was a small state, and it was caught up between two very large empires. So, from a military point of view, their focus was on defense. And defense was secured at the time by building fortifications. But this fortification had to be defended by people, otherwise they were just a bunch of stones, a pile of stones and wood, which served for nothing. And paying mercenaries to defend fortifications was very expensive. They afforded small groups of permanent garrisons, but they also had to increase the number of defenders in case of necessity. And the solution they implemented was to, as I've said before, to offer this semi-privileged status to some of the peasants living nearby, who performed military service when needed and when requested. Some of these peasants in Transylvania were called drabants. The most interesting part about them is the origin of the word. And it's quite a debate about, and we do have two different versions regarding the origin of this word. The most common, or the most successful so far, is the German origin. Trabant. This is a term which is very widespread in East Central Europe. We have the word in Romanian, in Hungarian, in Serbian, even in Swedish. The Swedes have the Polish. In Poland, they have Trabants, and of course the original word is Trabant, which means guardsman in German. And they were initially infantry soldiers from the Hussite Wars who defended the Wagenburg. So those were the first Trabants, and then the name was used to describe all these new infantry troops which are armed with gunpowder weapons. The second and somehow more interesting etymology or story about the origin is the Persian one, the Persian origin. Basically, and I hope I understood it correctly, those who claim that the word comes from the Persian word darband, which means, if I'm not mistaken, narrow pass or a closed gate as well. And in the Ottoman military system, we do have these particular groups of derbenchis, which defended some strategic points in the borderlands of the Ottoman Empire. And so far in scholarly literature, it has been stated that the word is derived from the Persian darband. Although it's still unclear from which part the word came into the Hungarian and Romanian language in this particular case, both the Transylvanian Drabants and the Ottoman derbenchis shared some very important basic similarities. They were peasants who were exempted from taxes in exchange for military service, but they were irregular troops and they only provided auxiliary military service, and their role was mainly a defensive one. Okay, a second case of a cross-cultural transfer in terms of an organization, a typology of soldier. We have this particular case of the Seimeni. So the Seimeni were initially mercenaries in the service of the rulers of Wallachia and Moldavia, but especially in Wallachia. They came from the Ottoman occupied territories, and they were Serbians, Bosnians, Albanians, but also Turks, some of them, who crossed the Danube and entered the service of the ruler of Wallachia. As a model, they were inspired by the Szegban Ottoman infantry, which became very common and very they represented a significant part of the Ottoman infantry, especially during the 17th century. And if I'm not mistaken, they are also famous for some major rebellions in the Ottoman Empire. In a similar manner, the Seimeni were also very rebellious, just like the Ottoman Szegban, and they caused a major rebellion in Wallachia in 1655 against Matei Basarab. They threatened his life and his rule, and only a Transylvanian intervention saved the situation. And in this context, the Seimen, this type of Balkan mercenaries, moved from Wallachia into Transylvania, and we, from 1645, we have the first Seimen mercenaries in Transylvania. A contemporary description of a Swedish ambassador who traveled to Transylvania mentions the fact that these soldiers were the best soldiers in the army of the Transylvanian prince, and they were also, they received the highest wage, and they formed the personal guard of the prince. And the same Jakob von Hildebrand is the Swedish ambassador's name. He says that these same men are very similar to Ottoman janissaries in both appearance and in their manner of marching and in the weapons they use and so on. So very similar to Ottoman janissaries as well. And we do find them for a very long time in the court registers of the Transylvanian Principality, even during the reign of the last Transylvanian prince, Michael Opofi I. He also had a small group of Seimen mercenaries who received the highest wages in an age when the prince also had German mercenaries, Polish mercenaries, and local soldiers. These Ottoman-inspired troops were considered the best of his troops, and they received the highest wage at the time. So these are two models of military organization which were adopted and then adapted from the Ottoman Empire to the Principality of Transylvania. Of course, along the Ottoman Habsburg borderland, there was a constant transfer of technology and military knowledge, and I think that the publications of Agoston Gabor have emphasized this process from many points of view, and he went very he offers many insights into this complex and interesting process. But the process also extended to relations with the Principality of Transylvania. So through both peaceful and violent means, there was a transfer of weapons and other, let's say, material items between the two spheres of civilization, so to speak. And if we look at the documents, we have, for example, fortress inventories from Transylvania, which mention the most easily distinguishable weapon was the janissary musket, and we do have janissary muskets in many inventories of border fortifications, together with weapons which were locally produced or with weapons which were brought from regions of Central and Western Europe. Also, there are many Turkish objects in the last wills, in the testaments of Transylvanian nobles, and what we find there are weapons, but not only weapons, other objects as well. Sabers, of course. Then we have this mante, which is a robe, a cloth, worn by Transylvanian nobles, which was similar to an Ottoman kaftan. Also horse trappings, as in this particular case, and then there's also the very interesting case of Ottoman carpets, which they still exist even today in a decent number in Saxon churches in Transylvania, and it's not a coincidence that they are in Saxon churches, because the Saxons were the ones, the Transylvanian Saxons, were the ones who intermediated trade from the Oriental trade with Eastern and Central Europe. So they brought commodities from the Ottoman Empire, and they distributed commodities, Oriental and Ottoman commodities, throughout Central and Eastern Europe. So this is also one of the reasons why we do have many objects of Turkish origin in Transylvania, because Transylvania was some sort of trade hub for the rest of the region, a trade hub for Oriental goods, spices, but also this type of goods. All right, so an interesting source from the late 17th century, which it's a very nice narrative source, which has been also translated into English. the work of Baron Peter Apor, Metamorphosis Transylvanien. Peter Apor was, he wrote the book in the early 18th century after Transylvania had been conquered by the Habsburgs, and in this book he remembers his youth during the last decades of the independent principality. And when the Habsburgs came to Transylvania, they began to change customs. They began to change fashion and so on. And he recalled, Apor, he recalled all the differences that existed before. And especially he focuses on some of the Ottoman elements that were incorporated into Transylvanian culture and which were in danger of disappearing at the time. So in his narrative, for example, he mentions this long manta, the robe, which was very similar to Ottoman kaftans and which had been used by Transylvanian nobles throughout the age of the Principality, but during the first decades of the 18th century, the fashion began to change, and they adopted the Habsburg fashion at the time. Another interesting element is the colorful silk sash, which they wore instead of belts, and which was once again considered that he explicitly says that it was a Turkish, an Ottoman habit. Then some of the younger Transylvanian nobles, they used to wear some items of like status symbols. They wore, for example, maces, but some of them also began to wear Tatar whips, so-called nohaika, which were of course taken from the Tatars. And one of the examples which I find most interesting is the habit of wearing furs of exotic animals, leopards and tigers. Leopards and tiger furs. They used to wear these furs over their usual garments and even over armor. And you find this type of military fashion, so to speak, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as well, but also in other parts of East Central Europe. And these, according to Peter Apor, these furs were, of course, brought from the Ottoman Empire. And also an interesting habit of dyeing the horses, of using colors to dye the horses when they went to war, which was also considered an Ottoman habit, but it's very peculiar because I wasn't able to find any other sources on this particular habit of dyeing horses, war horses. Maybe if you encountered such examples. Okay, so this would be this topic of Ottoman influence on Transylvania is a rather new one, although it's somehow peculiar because it was obvious that Transylvania was an Ottoman tributary state, but many historians have always insisted on the local particularities, and they refuse to look into this idea of cross-cultural transfers. And this is a new topic. These are just a few of the insights that I've been working on during the last few years in my research. So one of the conclusion would be that, of course, this influence was not limited to the age of the Principality. It was much older, as I've said before. It began probably from the beginning of the 14th century. Elements were gradually transferred, and they were adopted and adapted by Transylvanian society in general and by the army in particular. Of course, when the Principality of Transylvania was established, Ottoman suzerainty was a very important element because it favored this process of cultural transfer in the field of warfare, but not only. And of course, as we have seen, these transfers occurred through violent, but also through peaceful interactions between the Ottoman Empire and Transylvania, just like the other Christian states of East Central Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.